Hello there, folks. How are you doing? It's time for another polling update. I know. Started off going, yeah, I'll do it once a month, and it's beginning to turn into once a week. But we have had a significant poll today, and it is our first clear reform lead in a poll. Previously, we'd had some where reform tied with another party in first place, but this is the first one where they're out in front, and out in front by 3 points, which is, that's quite a margin. That isn't no single point we're talking about here. So this is a poll from Find Out Now. If a general election was held tomorrow, how would you vote? Reform 26%, Conservatives 23%, Labour 22%, and third place on 22%. That's pretty darn low for Labour in a poll as well. Liberal Democrats on 12, Greens on 10, SNP 3, others 3, Plaid Cymru 1. Hello there in the chat to Shockwave. Starbourne on course for the worst Labour result in Wales since 1918. Lee Hallam here as well and says, hi, Swiss. Hello there. So given that at the start of the year, one of my predictions for the year that I'd set out was that reform would top a poll at some point in January, and we'd sort of said it hadn't quite done it when they were tired, but now they've done it. I think it's worth saying, okay, then this one has occurred. I've got another screen that I want to share with you as well. So I just showed you what the headline voting intention from that poll was, but this is a graphic that was also shared by the same pollster, and this is saying where, according to them, reform's support is coming from. So on the left-hand side here, we have what voters were backing in the 2024 election. On the right-hand side, the January 2025 poll. So as you can see, about half of it was the previous reform votes. 18% coming from the Conservatives, 9% coming from Labour, 6% coming from others. But significantly as well here, you have 19%, and this is a chunk that says they did not vote. And when I saw where this image had been posted, it had said that these were people who had not voted in 2024, but said that they were certain to vote come the next election. That's the criteria for them being included in that one there. So that is interesting, because we have been talking about this in terms of which parties are they bringing support away from. But of course, there is the other factor, which is that we had a very low turnout in the last general election, a very significant chunk of the British population who simply just didn't go out to vote. So one would assume if you can get them to notice what's going on and get them interested in politics, then they suddenly become part of the equation, whereas previously they weren't. I imagine we had a similar kind of thing going on, for example, with Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. I think that definitely in 2017. Anecdotally, but I also think I saw some data that suggested it as well, that you did have a number of people that hadn't voted in previous elections that were coming out to vote. Now, of course, I will also say it's hard to boil down from just these numbers what kind of non-voters have been drawn to reform, if that makes sense, because we have evidence that suggests that a large number of Tory voters stayed home in the 2024 general election, or at least enough of them to impact the results. So it could well be, perhaps, that reform have got a chunk of support from people who voted Tory in 2024, but also people who usually vote Tory but didn't vote in the last election. Now maybe they're voting reform as well. Of course, there could also be people who just generally aren't politically engaged at all. It's hard to glean that from just this single little grey bar here, but I thought that was interesting and worth pointing out as well. Let's take a few comments from you guys. Shockwave says, I once only entertained the idea of a con reform two-party system 6 years ago. It might actually happen. I'm not sure about a con reform two-party system. It's simply just because both of them sit on the right. I'd struggle to see how we'd end up with the two of them as the two main parties with the most seats when they both, are competing for a similar slice of the electorate, if that makes sense. But I wouldn't discount the idea that reform becomes one of the two parties in a two-party system. One would assume versus Labour. And I understand perhaps where you're getting that from. If you're saying, "Oh, well, look at this poll: Reform and the Tories in first and second, and then Labour in third," would that not suggest, them two being the two main parties, since they're both in the lead? Perhaps that's where you were coming from with that. But I think things like even just basic sort of elements of tactical voting that you'd get towards an election, where people would go, right, maybe we don't necessarily like Labour, but we really don't want to see Reform or the Tories in. We'd be more inclined to vote for them. But I wouldn't anticipate at this point the idea of Reform and the Tories supplanting the Tories and Labour as the two main parties. Drew says maybe the solution all along was to never react to the reactionaries. Lee Hallam says if you pop into the electoral calculus, it gives the three main parties much the same seats. That would leave the Tories as kingmakers, able to form a coalition with Labour or Reform. Yeah, we are very much in sort of hung parliament territory at the moment as far as what the polls are currently saying. What's interesting about this particular poll is that, some projections that I've seen similar to that, where you put in the numbers and say how would it turn out in terms of seats. This particular poll is probably one of the first ones I've seen that has had Reform as the largest party with the largest number of seats. But wider picture, very much hung parliament. But poll on poll, pollster versus pollster, you're having Labour out in front, you've got Reform out in front. You can have hardly any difference between them. So it's a very muddy picture at the moment how things would end up if hypothetically there was an election tomorrow. But of course, we're not in that position. We do have a long way to go until the next election. Shockwave says Conservatives would be more David Cameron mode, leftist socially, right economically. Reform would be full nationalist, rightist socially, left-wing economically. Okay. Well, as I say, I don't see that happening at the moment. I understand your thought process behind it and where you'd set the two parties to one another, but especially as I'd say the Tories at the moment are arguably trying to shadow Reform, or have moved closer to a Farage type platform over the course of the last 5-10 years, or even just with Kemi Badenoch. I don't see that happening. I still see Labour as being the most likely opposition to whichever right-wing party wins out as being the largest party. Podger's here and says, "Sup, boys." Lee Hallam says, "But no grand left-wing coalition this time, at least in this poll." So looking at the polling more broadly here, I'm just going to bring us over to our much-loved Wikipedia table here. As ever, the graph crawls forwards closer and closer. We've now hit a point where Reform has actually just about crossed the Tories with their little moving average lines there. Labour remains a little bit ahead, but still dipping there somewhat. And we have had one other, since the last time I spoke to you about polling. Obviously, we've led with the Find Out Now poll, because that's quite interesting, being Reform ahead by 3 points. But it's also been are they called Techni? Is that how you say it out loud? I've only ever read the word. Techni has won with Labour on 25%, the Conservatives on 24%, and Reform on 24%. Also, so this one being a lead for Labour, basically a three-way dead heat between the parties. But as we've sort of looked at, a lot of these polls that have come out this month in particular, as I've said, we're in a situation where it's a three-way contest between Labour, the Conservatives, and Reform. Any given poll seems to have one or the others out in front. I suppose, actually, with the exception of the Tories, have not had a poll where they have been the sole. No, they have. My mistake. A More in Common poll from mid of January. They did have a poll where they were at 1 point in front. Okay, then. But you see the picture that I'm saying. Generally speaking, from what we've had this year so far, I'd say easily half or more of the polls have had Labour out in front, although admittedly by very tight margins. Then you've got a chunk of them that have had ties, and the odd one here and there that have had the Tories and Reform. But as I say, it's a three-way contest. Labour, on average, are still out there in front of the others at the moment, but it's very, very tight. And if we were trying to map this to a general election scenario, we definitely say that within the margin of error, feasibly any three of the parties could be the party that wins the most votes. Were there a general election tomorrow? Shockwave says the narrative that 2024 was to Labour what 1906 was to the Liberals may prove correct. I'm maybe. I mean, I know obviously that the Liberals were ultimately supplanted as one of the two main parties versus the Tories in the early 20th century. I didn't know the significance of the 1906 election. But obviously, on your theory of Labour eventually biting the dust, I'm assuming you think that's a similar thing then. Drew replies to Shockwave and says that David Cameron was right wing on both accounts. Claire King says Swiss still won't talk about the Lib Dems. I mean, I've mentioned them in passing, haven't I? Polling wise, there's not really a lot to say about the Lib Dems at the moment. They don't really seem to have shifted much from where they were in the general election. The polling pretty much maps fairly closely within a point or two where they were at the general election. So there's not really been that much movement for the Liberal Democrats, to be honest. They're about where they were before. Most of the projections I've seen where you plug in the poll numbers into the little models, how the seats end up, they tend to have the Lib Dems on a similar number of seats to what they have now. So there's just not an awful lot to say about them. The Lib Dems outside of polling, Ed Davey's been quite busy recently, hasn't he? He's come out and called for joining a customs union, and previously his leadership of the Lib Dems had them, kind of staying back from Brexit issues for a bit, and he's sort of been quite forceful against like Trump and Musk and all the rest of it, and obviously you're able to, aren't you, when you're in opposition? As Labour found out, when they were in opposition, David Lammy, Keir Starmer and friends, they could say whatever they liked about Donald Trump. Then they got into government, and as we've seen, suddenly they've done 180 U-turns and they're not saying publicly any of the things that they said before. Now, whether they've changed their minds or whether tactically they just think, let's not piss off the most powerful man in the world. There we are. But yeah, for my part, considering I was a Lib Dem voter in the last election, which is still a peculiar thing to say, I have noticed Davey in the past. Ever since Elon Musk called him a cretin, actually. Ever since Elon Musk called him a cretin, he seems to have got a bit based in the last few weeks of actually doing stuff. What else have we got here? Shockwave says the presence of the Greens, I think, has kept the Lib Dems down in the poll. This is the thing, isn't it? This is an interesting thing that in a lot of these polls, if you add the Conservatives and Reform together, you get something approaching 45 to 50%. If you add Labour and the Lib Dems and the Greens together, you again get something similar, and then whatever the margin in the middle is obviously your SNP, your Plaid, your Northern Ireland parties, whatever. So yeah, as much as we are sort of talking about the right being split between the Conservatives and Reform, which is not something we often see in the right of the country, on the right of politics in this country, usually it's the left that's a lot more split. It is also worth noting that the left remains more split than the right is, even though this is a new dynamic for the right at the moment, and there's a new party that's come along challenging the Tories for their dominance on the right of politics. As you can sort of see in the polling, Labour, the Lib Dems, Greens, all parties that feasibly, if push came to shove in a very hung parliament, had to cobble together some kind of coalition. You'd imagine the three of them would sooner work with each other rather than working with the Tories or Reform, as you would imagine the Tories and Reform would rather work with each other than work with Labour, the Lib Dems, or the Greens. And yes, I am fully aware that 2010 there was a coalition between Conservatives and the Lib Dems, but you know what? A lot changes in 15 years. Let me do a few more of these comments here. Podge says, some will think inflation, debt, and interest rates as they are now. UK may need an IMF bailout. I've sort of skimmed a couple of. I've not even really read about it. I've seen that being mentioned in a couple of headlines in the past few days, but I don't know. I'm holding fire on jumping into that at the moment. I've seen sort of like quite a lot of bad news for the economy in the past month or two. Then I've seen a couple of things that actually suggest that maybe it's not as bad as it was looking before. It seems to be very much on a knife edge, whether we're in a really shitty situation or just a regular kind of fairly anemic growth stagnant situation, which is obviously also not a good situation to be in, but it's better than a sort of a crisis, you know. Lee Hallam says customs union without a single market is the stupidest idea possible. It offers nothing. And Podge adds, never go full Lib Dem. Shockwave says, imagine if we get by accident PR while still having first past the post, so the vote is split. I did think about this scenario, actually. I thought about what if, and again, this is a total what if. I'm not, this isn't a prediction of any kind. I just thought about it as an interesting little thing to ponder on. What if you end up maybe a year out from the next general election, and at that point in time, events as they are have led to some kind of a pact between Reform and the Tories electorally, whether it's standing down for each other in certain seats or standing on joint tickets on certain seats or just focusing resources. So it doesn't really matter what shape or form it takes. But imagine, if you will, that's the scenario. You end up with the Tories and Reform both agreeing to cooperate with one another in the upcoming general election, and their total vote share between them probably, you know, being in the realms of 45, 50, maybe even 55%, something like that, you know. It would be really quite funny in a way if because obviously in a first past the post system, working together like that would probably deliver them an enormous number of seats relative to the support that they've got as parties, because first past the post kind of, you know, magnifies anyone over about 25 to 30% of the vote and seriously suppresses anyone significantly below that. It would be really funny to me if Labour saw that as the writing on the wall and went, oh shit, look at this, Reform and the Tories working together now with their electoral pact, and it's going to deliver them a bunch more seats than it would do otherwise, and we're really screwed. Maybe it's time to bring in not first past, but maybe it's time to bring in proportional representation. Maybe now is finally the time. That the only way that they could possibly try to block Reform and the Tories ending up in government is to bring in PR, and then maybe the combined vote share of both of them is just low enough that they could cobble together some other coalition to keep them out of office. As I say, that's, you know, this is pie in the sky thinking, but it's an interesting time at the moment politically. Well, to be fair, when haven't I said that in the entire time we've been doing the channel? We've lived through never-ending interesting political times, haven't we? Since about 2016 or so. Lee Hallam says bailout 1976 again. I remember it well. Podge says I see Tory Reform non-aggression pact like Labour Lib Dem last time. Podge says what kind of PR would we end up with? I don't know. I hadn't thought that scenario out, you know, so in depth. Single transferable vote. Why not? We'll say that one. And Shockwave says, thank God we live in these times. Okay. Is there anything else I want to look at here? Have we got stuff on the preferred? Is there anything new out of Scotland? There's one here from Survation from the 7th to the 13th of January. That one has Labour on 24, the SNP on 33, Conservatives on 14, Lib Dems 9, Reform on 15. There as well, and the Greens on 4. Anywhere else? Do we have Wales? Wales, are you with us? No, nothing from this year from Wales. And leadership approval. Have we had anything new there? We might have had some new stuff since the last time we looked. Okay, then. Continuing to look very bad for Keir Starmer. Continuing to not look great for Kemi Badenoch. Continuing to not look great for Nigel Farage, for that matter, either. Ed Davey, perhaps the least unpopular of the main party leaders, and the Greens just aren't on anyone's radar, I suppose. Okay, then. All right, then. Lee Hallam says it could happen, Swiss. Only self-interest would bring in PR. Well, that was my thought. That was my thought, because as we've said many, many times before, you know, turkeys don't want to vote for Christmas. Why would parties such as Labour or the Tories bring in proportional representation when first past the post has served them so well as keeping them as the two main parties. It wouldn't work. Even if Labour members and maybe even a bulk of Labour voters want proportional representation, the Labour bods just simply wouldn't do it because it wouldn't be advantageous to them. But if the winds of change finally shift it to be, actually, there'd be a better chance of blocking Reform and the Tories getting in if they were working together with a form of PR. That might be the point in time Labour actually finally consider it. And one would assume, well, I mean, it doesn't even matter that all the other smaller parties want PR. Labour's got a huge stonking majority in Parliament. You know, they could bring it in pretty quick towards the end of the Parliament if they needed to. STV works well in Ireland. SNP, we're back, baby. Podge says, do you see Starmer being one term? Well, given that my default nowcast since, I don't know, when was it that I said it, November or December, was that come the next election, I thought we'd probably see Reform in power, either alone or with the Conservatives. I suppose I would have to say, yes, I do see Starmer being a one-term Prime Minister at the moment. Again, this is it's a bit vague and tricky for me to explain in a way, but this is me sort of trying to guess where things will end up in a few years' time based off of where we presently are and where one could reasonably expect them to go based off of where we are at the moment. But of course, all sorts of things can change in the next few years. It's perfectly possible that something occurs in the next little while, which makes me have to go back and reevaluate and say, oh, hang on a minute. Maybe that doesn't seem like the most likely thing anymore. But at the very least, in the couple of months or so since I first said I think Reform will end up being in the next government, events have only really strengthened that view and borne out what I already believed, especially that I sort of said, oh, you know, they'll be topping the polls or a poll at least by January, and indeed they were. So yeah, for the time being, I see Starmer being one term. You know, I'd love it if Labour deliver. Wouldn't that be nice? Certainly, some of the things that they want to do will take a few years. So maybe there'll be something to show for their time in office. He says in a few years' time, but we'll have to wait and see, won't we? Jallo Punk says, before PR, Labour will go for votes for 16-year-olds and foreigners. Well, at the very least, Labour have already, from what I'm aware, they've already got votes for 16-year-olds on their agenda. Is it also, when you say for foreigners, would that be for like EU citizens or people that have lived in this country for a certain amount of time? I don't know as much about that one being floated as I do the votes at 16-year-olds. But yeah, again, from a self-interest point of view, I could probably see them wanting to tweak who is eligible to vote under the current system, assuming that that would do well for them, rather than change the voting system altogether when there are those different options in front of them at the moment. And Shockwave says, this is democracy, man. You know what? I got this shirt for Christmas, and it's probably one of my favorite shirts right now. This is Democracy Manifest. All right then, guys, that is it for the time being. I just wanted to speak to you about the latest couple of polls. So obviously we've had a lot of focus during this on Reform and saying that they've obviously had a poll where they're now quite clearly ahead. Of course, as the overall situation presently sits, it is still pretty much a three-way tie between Labour, the Tories, and Reform. I suppose the question we have to ask ourselves about any of these parties for that matter, you could for Labour and the Tories, the question would be, what is their bottom? Where do they stop falling in terms of support? At what point do people stop switching from them to other parties? And with Reform, we ask a similar question when we say, at what point does their momentum begin to slow down? Because they've been putting on support pretty consistently for the past few months, but eventually one assumes they're going to hit a little bit of a wall where the easiest to reach voters who either don't vote at the moment or are supporting other parties come over to them, and then we sort of see things even out, because we're in a situation of a lot of change at the moment, a lot of crossover between the party support. So where things ultimately end up will be interesting. I would speculate. At the moment, he's being very careful here because he doesn't want to be tied to this prediction. I would speculate at the moment. I would not expect to see Labour or the Tories dropping significantly below 20%, and likewise, I wouldn't expect Reform to rise much above 30% either. Yeah, I guess I'll say that. So I guess that as much as there may still continue to be some change for the for the short medium term at least, I'd imagine that all three parties would still remain in the 20 somethings for the most part. There we are. I'm happy with that one. That one's fine. All right then, guys, that is it for the time being. If you've enjoyed the stream, please do drop it a like. I'll see you all later on. Ta-ta.